legalizefreedom.com. Why are we here? Where do we come from? Where are we going? From the nature of reality to the future of humanity. Listen without limits. Unchain your brain. Change your thinking. Change your life. legalizefreedom.com.
Listen patiently. We, who are the last men, earnestly desire to communicate with you. Astronomers have made a startling discovery, which assigns a speedy end to humankind. We can help you, and we need your help.
Greetings and welcome once again to legalizefreedom.com. I'm your host Greg Moffat, and my guest today is Thomas Lombardo, who joins us to discuss cosmic evolution and the future of humanity through the lens of science fiction. Our view of the future of our species tends to be coloured by very short-term concerns. Most of us are too busy with the distractions and worries of everyday life to spend much time thinking about what lies ahead when we are no longer here. As for the future of the Earth, our solar system and the wider cosmos, these are deemed the domain of scientific specialists and of little relevance to the urgent political, social, economic and environmental problems which plague the present day. However, contemplating the incomprehensible vastness of creation can help us recapture a sense of wonder and possibility and nurture a cosmic consciousness which puts our present predicament into perspective. This mental evolutionary process may ultimately make the difference between survival and extinction for life in our remote corner of the galaxy. The discussion takes as its starting point the work of English science fiction author Olaf Stapledon, specifically his novels Last and First Men and Star Maker. Hello and welcome, Tom, and thank you so much for joining us once again on legalizefreedom.com.
Yes, hello Greg, how are you today?
I'm very well, thank you. And you're looking well, I have to say.
It's a bright, sunny, warm day in Arizona.
Okay, so it's a dark, overcast, cold day here in England. Now, today we're going to be talking a little bit essentially about human evolution, but also the bigger idea of evolution within the galaxy and the wider cosmos. And we're going to be doing that through the lens of science fiction. Before we jump into our talk, just for listeners who don't know, give them a little bit of information about your background and your work.
Yes, I'm the director of the Center for Future Consciousness. I was a college professor for decades, became an active futurist, have written around 10 books, which I've published. Well, 2 are coming out very soon, a number of them in the area of science fiction, but also quite a few on the evolution of future consciousness and other areas pertaining to philosophy, education, psychology. I live in a suburb of Phoenix, Arizona, and I've had a passion and interest in science fiction since I was a kid.
Now, our kicking off point today is a novel by an English author called Olaf Stapledon, and he was active mainly in the early 20th century, and it's his novel Last and First Men, which I recently discovered. That's, the book's been around for decades, but of all my reading of sci-fi over the years, that's just not one that I ever got to. And I wanted to have this talk with you today because the thing that struck me about it more than anything I've ever read in science fiction was the vast scale
of time that the book takes in and the vast scope of it. And it really struck a chord with me because it is in contrast to the narrow outlook that so many of us have on life, the universe and everything. And we often don't look more than, in what's happening the next day, never mind what might be happening in 1,000 years or 100,000 years or 1,000,000 years from now. It almost seems like, why contemplate anything like that? Because it seems irrelevant in a way to our lives. But it struck me at this time as well that for the last year that we've lived through, with the pandemic, because it seemed to me that people's thinking and their outlook had become even more constricted and more narrow during this time, because the only thing that seemed to be happening was the pandemic, and any thoughts of the future, any thoughts of building for the future, of optimism, seemed to just be disappearing at a rapid rate. So all of that meant that for me, the book just really resonated, very strongly at this point in time. So perhaps you could, just comment on what I've said and maybe tell people a little bit about the book and the author.
Yeah. Stapledon, was a PhD in philosophy. Got it back in the, late 1920s. And one philosopher who he admired was the rationalist philosopher Baruch Spinoza. And Spinoza believed that the only way one could get a accurate, true picture of anything was to see it through the eyes of the cosmos, the big picture. And so one of the key elements in Stapledon, which he took from Spinoza, was that Stapledon believed the only really accurate way one could look at today or look at the specifics of one's life was in the context of the big picture, the cosmic picture. That if we take too narrow a view as to our reality, then we're at a more primitive level of mentality, of consciousness. And the only way we can really see deeply what all this means, even just the right here and now, is to broaden our perspective out and look at it through the eyes of the universe, the entirety of the universe. So Stapledon wrote two novels, Last and First Men and Star Maker, in which he, in his imagination, traveled out billions and billions of years into the future. That is, when he thought about the future evolution of humanity in Last and First Men, he chronicled, speculatively of course, the entire future history of humanity running out 2 billion years into the future. When he wrote Star Maker, he chronicled the future evolution of intelligence in the entirety of the universe, running out 30 billion years into the future. Now, there have been other science fiction writers who have, in different ways, approximated to that kind of big picture perspective, but nobody to the extent of Stapledon. Bear a couple, I would say, in some ways come close. Arthur C. Clarke identifies Stapledon as the most influential writer on his own development, and Arthur C. Clarke, in fact, says that Star Maker is the greatest work of imagination ever produced by anybody. Now, we were going to focus on Last and First Men, which he wrote and published in 1931. Star Maker he published in 1937. In Last and First Men, he speculates on how humanity over the next 2 billion years will evolve through 18 different distinctive species, but eventually we will go extinct about 2 billion years in the future, having settled by then on the planet Neptune. Stapledon at that time didn't know that the planet Neptune was a gas giant. He envisioned it as a solid surface, so he did get some things wrong, obviously. But while he's doing this, while he takes on this big picture, as a philosopher and a psychologist, he gets into it with great enthusiasm and color and intelligence. What is life all about? What is the nature of humanity? What are the potentials of humanity? Where could we be heading? Acknowledging that there's going to be lots of ups and downs along the way. Where should we go? How should we evolve? And on that point, I want to highlight something critical to Stapledon's view of the big picture. Stapledon saw reality through the eyes of cosmic evolution. Whether we're talking about humanity or the universe as a whole, he saw reality as an evolutionary reality beginning with the formation of the simplest, most primitive patterns and entities and particles and forces in the distant past. And over time, the evolutionary process has been ongoing, and things of greater intelligence and greater complexity keep emerging in this ongoing narrative of existence. That is, for Stapledon, the fundamental principle to see everything in terms of is it's an evolutionary process going on. And we today are just part of that overall evolutionary process. We evolved from things that were more primitive than us, and we will evolve into things that are more advanced than us. And this is an inexorable, filled with sound and fury and mayhem and chaos and everything else. It's an inexorable process that runs through the history of the Earth, the history of the solar system, the history of the universe as a whole. And when he thinks about evolution with respect to humans, being a philosopher and a psychologist, although he did not slight how we could evolve technologically, he talks about that a lot, he focuses on how we could evolve mentally, consciously, socially, ethically. That is, he puts his focus on the conscious mind and how it, the human conscious mind, could advance much further than today. That he does the same thing when he talks about intelligence in the universe. How would intelligence in the universe evolve? How could there be the emergence of a mind of the universe in the far distant future? So he focuses on mental evolution as opposed to gadgetry, although he talks about gadgetry quite a bit along the way. And in fact, for those listeners who are familiar with the concept of the Dyson sphere, as one example that is attributed to the astronomer and scientist Freeman Dyson. Freeman Dyson really got that idea, and he acknowledges so, from Stapledon, of creating an orbiting shell around a sun as a surface on which to live and on which to capture the full energy of a star. And Stapledon had that idea and developed it in his novel Star Maker. So Stapledon did get into speculations on technological development and space travel, but he focused in on thinking about what ways can the conscious mind, human or otherwise, advance, evolve in the future. So that's a sort of a quick introduction to Olaf Stapledon and Last and First Men, and then his overall perspective that he took. So when we think about today and having a constrictive a mindset on our reality, where we tend to focus more on the immediate here and now, there's lots of reasons why that's the case. But speaking as someone from the perspective of Stapledon, he would say that what's critical is that we move out of that. We get out of that. We need to get out of that. We need to get out of just a narrower perspective, and we need to start to think ahead, and we need to expand our consciousness. And sooner or later we will. But having a limited consciousness to the here and now I would say is an indication of a threatened fear response to reality, where we close up and narrow our mind because we feel in a state, we feel more in a survival mode state. And that indeed happens psychologically when there's threat. The here and now becomes more important, and the future and the past become less important.
Well, this might be a little bit of a curveball, but I've done quite a lot of reading and writing and thinking around Jungian ideas, psychoanalytic ideas and mythical ideas, and in relation to the situation we found ourselves in with the pandemic. And one reading of it, and I've had a couple of guests on to talk about this, one reading is that we're kind of this is an evolutionary push that we're receiving at the moment, to do some of the mental development that you're speaking about. That this is an indication to us that we need to move forward in some ways. Now the response to that hasn't been particularly encouraging, but nevertheless, it's one reading that has resonated with me. That is, we're being given a message here. There's an attempt for us to be taught a lesson. And basically it's an evolutionary push, and how we respond to that, well, it remains to be seen. But that's what it is. Yeah.
I agree with that interpretation entirely. In fact, what we're doing right now is going to dig down a little bit deeper, both into Stapledon and the whole idea of evolution. And the basic point being raised here is that crises and challenges are stimuli that provoke evolution. That evolution will often occur when our existence is threatened. And so if we see that our present mode of existence, socially, technologically, has flaws in it, those flaws become all the more apparent in a time of crisis and challenge. And it can push us, it can, not necessarily will, but can push us to a higher level of adaptation, a higher level of understanding. And Stapledon believed that too, understanding evolution, that it's the crises, the challenges, the problems that move evolution along. We become too complacent and don't move when there aren't challenges. So, for example, today, in the midst of the pandemic crisis, it seems to me very clear that humanity should, whether it will or not, but should realize a much better, higher level of global cooperation as opposed to nationalistic competition. Create a more unified, balanced, collective consciousness, because we face a global problem that we are not handling very well globally. And even though we might think that, well, we're going to take care of our neighborhood, take care of our country, the situation we're in right now is not a situation that is a problem that's going to go away as long as our country handles it right. No, it's only going to really get under control when collectively we get it right. And to push it a little bit further, the United States and Great Britain and some of the other countries in the West are beginning to get a handle on COVID and bring the numbers down with the vaccine and other things. But while that's going on, the second most populous country in the world is in the middle of hell right now, India, with COVID. And India's suffering, but the fact that India's suffering is something that we all will suffer because of until we work together. And so crises will force us to work together. Crises will force us to move forward. And in this case here, the moving forward is going to be working together better and seeing that we have a common set of problems and challenges. In this case here, pandemics, because this won't necessarily be the last one. and that we need to collectively come together better in dealing with them, because what hurts people in another part of the world will eventually ripple out and hurt us too.
Yeah, now, you mentioned challenges in relation to evolution, and this brings to mind the concept of punctuated equilibrium in evolution versus the sort of gradualism of Darwinian evolution. And basically, punctuated equilibrium, you maybe give a better definition than me, but it's environmental circumstances pushing a species to evolve, or perhaps to, split into two different species, whatever it happens to be. And then that's interspersed with long periods of stasis. Whereas the gradualism of Darwin was that, that things are changing all the time but at an imperceptible way, because over such a long period of time. And that's something that you see in Stapledon, with Last and First Men, Star Maker, that, that the environmental circumstances, things change, challenges come up, and the humanity evolves over quite rapidly in evolutionary terms as a response to those challenges and crises.
Yeah, the idea of punctuated equilibrium, which you pretty well got, is that the fossil history doesn't show this gradual transformation of species and ecosystems. It shows periods of relatively stable species and ecosystems with intermittent periods of rapid ecological change among many species at the same time. So for a great deal of the time, things will stay relatively the same, not completely, relatively so. And then for relatively short periods of time, there'll be big changes. Now, you can think about this with your own life, too. You'll have periods in your life that are relatively stable for 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 years, whatever it may be. And then there'll be rather abrupt transformations. That is, I think punctuated equilibria applies to the evolution of individuals as well. And we get used to the periods of stability, of extended stability, and we forget that every so often there's going to be periods of abrupt change. Now, we should bring in here something about Stapledon on this, which is that Stapledon believed in the possibility of purposeful evolution. And what I mean by that is you could imagine biological evolution as adaptation to a changing environment. But Stapledon believed that given sufficient knowledge, we can achieve the capacity to intentionally modify ourselves, both psychologically and physically, biologically, intentionally so, and redesign ourselves. So within the 18 species that he chronicles in Last and First Men, there are quite a few of those species that were actually created by the previous species in a relatively short period of time. A redesign. We do redesigns. So if things, for example, fall apart, or we get a challenge going on, we can do a redesign, or we may decide to do a redesign for some other reason. So part of the punctuated process would involve, with the emergence of a high level of consciousness like us, the capacity to, recreate ourselves in a new form, physically and psychologically. And that could happen relatively quickly. So that could go on too. Yeah, so Stapledon definitely understood the notion of abrupt, fast change. He also threw into this the idea that we should also consider regarding today, that sometimes an evolutionary jump comes as a consequence of a disaster. That is, instead of the present ecosystem or present species being able to adapt and jump forward very quickly, the present species and ecosystem, to certain degrees, falls apart, allowing for something new to emerge to take its place. And that's happened throughout history, and that's happened throughout human history in particular. And Stapleton believed that, and so does H.G. Wells believe that too, that there will be catastrophes. We could have a catastrophe here. And that would definitely kick us into the opportunity for a redesign and a transformation of humanity.
Yeah, Stapledon does speak about things like genetic engineering, geoengineering, and planetary terraforming, and things that were they became staples of science fiction later. But he was speaking about some of these things at a time when the technology wasn't there. There was no even it was pure imagination. It couldn't even be conceived that it could become a reality. So, that makes him very ahead of his time and very influential, which again is more surprising to me that in all my decades of reading sci-fi that I didn't come across his work.
Well, yeah, Stapleton isn't a prominent figure in pop culture. It's such as Jules Verne has been, H.G. Wells has been, Arthur C. Clarke, maybe Isaac Asimov, Robert Heinlein. Those science fiction writers achieved a certain level of fame in pop culture. Stapleton, if you're in science fiction, if you're an avid fan of it, you're liable to run across them. But once you run across them and it hits you that shit, this character really had a colossal imagination, a very creative imagination, and his visions were very influential on lots of other science fiction writers. But his popularity in pop culture isn't there. He somehow gets lost in the translation. Like we were talking, Greg, about Last and First Men, and you had mentioned to me about a month ago that Johan Johansson had created a movie based on the novel, and fortunately I was able to watch the movie, and it would be a challenge to make a relatively accurate movie of either Star Maker or Last and First Men, because they're so rich and so expansive and so intricate. How could you put them up on the screen? Although maybe now with increased special effects, and if someone wants to sit for 2 or 3 hours, you could do a halfway decent job of it. The movie Last and First Men, which was produced, is artistic, creative, very moody, great ambience, great musical score, great imagery, but a lot of the detail, a lot of the depth of the novel is not in the movie. But it would be a real challenge to get it into a movie because of the richness of Stapleton's imagination and the things he envisions. Like Stapleton back in 1930, and people are of course familiar with this, Stapleton envisioned that along the saga of humanity, at one point we decide to turn ourselves into giant brains hooked up to technological lines of communication, and that we live in virtual realities in these giant brains. That's like something you would hear from today, but Stapleton was writing about that in 1930. And also redesigning ourselves so that we had wings that we could fly about. That was another version of humanity that Stapleton envisioned. Or putting a pair of eyes on the back of our heads so we could have omnidirectional vision. And that's another of the species. In fact, Stapleton even invents the idea of putting an eye on the top of our head so that we can be continuously in a state of cosmic awareness, looking up at the stars all the time. So the 18th men, the last men, in fact, in Stapleton, have 5 eyes. And in fact, on top of all that, there are 96 relatively distinct sexes that have to come together into a group consciousness to produce an offspring. So there's lots of very fascinating and intricate ideas in Last and First Men, which demonstrate the creativity of his imagination. And it would be a challenge, of course, to get that up on a screen.
Yeah, that's one of the things that occurred to me was with some of the other better known sci-fi authors that their work had been translated into television and movies, which is where, because these days, most people, how should I put it? The amount of books being read is kind of like, has been in decline. A lot of young people don't read books at all. But
Right.
they'll consume visual media and also computer games. A lot of sci-fi has been turned into computer games. But something like Last and First Men or Star Maker are basically unfilmable. So I would say that Johan Johansson's interpretation is more like a response to the novel than anything else, because that's all you can really do. And I'd imagine, I mean, even if you look at it in a really crude way, okay, so we're going to film Last and First Men. We've got 18 iterations of humanity to go through. And for the film, if we spend 10 minutes on each iteration, how long does that add up to? Straight away, you can see the problem. It was a bit like David Lynch trying to film Dune, which I remember reading Dune and some of the sequels thinking this cannot be translated to the screen, but he tried his best. And I don't know, I can't remember the name of the book, but there's a Russian sci-fi author, and one of his books was turned into a movie a few years ago called Hard to Be a God.
Oh yeah, that's the Stratsky brothers.
Yeah,
Russian.
no, that is the most, even outside, I mentioned David Lynch, so even outside of something like Eraserhead, Hard to Be a God is the most challenging cinematic presentation that I've ever sat through. And when I went to see it, some people walked out. So I can only imagine that trying to film Last and First Men or Star Maker would result in something that will be about 3 or 4 times. You'd probably have to spend a day watching it, and it would be more challenging than Hard to Be a God.
Yeah. Well, a long time ago, when I first got into reading science fiction and fantasy, one of my favorite readings was Tolkien's The Lord of the Rings, with The Hobbit, of course, thrown in as the 4th book. And I thought, wouldn't it be great, but next to impossible, to ever put this up on the screen? But eventually, it was achieved very well, with the advances in special effects and creating, 4. Well, actually, they created 6 movies out of those 4 books. Lord of the Rings has more action, adventure, individual characters than Last and First Men does, or Star Maker. I could see possibly something a little richer being done. This isn't to criticize Johansson's Last and First Men, but Johansson leaves out in that movie the intricate richness of the saga of humanity through the various species, as we, first of all, our own species pretty much destroying itself out of greed and materialism, and too much of a focus on technology and being too egocentric and narrow-minded. That in and of itself is an important opening theme. But then we have the Martians invading us along the way in Last and First Men. We have to migrate from the Earth to Venus, and then we have to migrate from Venus to Neptune. And along the way, there are various challenges and stories, great stories to be told about as humanity transforms. The cinematic version of it would be good. So, although it would be a challenge, I could see doing something that's a bit more intricate. The intricacy and the richness of Last and First Men, the evolutionary saga, sort of got lost in the movie. It focuses primarily on reflections and thoughts of the last men. But we can get more of that. We could get more of that into a movie. It'd be a different kind of movie, than the one that was done.
That concludes part 1 of our interview. Part 2 will be available soon in the subscribers area at legalizefreedom.com.
legalizefreedom.com